In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. This advice, simple as it was, stayed with me as I moved from the Midwest to New York. I tried to reserve judgment, as he suggested, but something about the world I stepped into that summer made it impossible to keep that rule in place. New York, 1922, was a city alive with promise and wealth, full of flashing lights and exuberant dreams. But there was something about it, something underneath the surface, that struck me as deeply hollow. I had rented a small house in West Egg, an area populated with the new money, men and women who had worked hard to build their fortunes and who weren't afraid to flaunt them. It was a place of ostentation and ambition, where the houses were large but lacked the quiet sophistication of their counterparts across the bay in East Egg. East Egg, the realm of the old money, was full of families who had inherited their wealth. Families who didn't need to prove anything because their money, their lineage, spoke for itself. But I, an outsider, found myself caught between these two worlds. West Egg, where the dreamers lived, and East Egg, where the dream had already been achieved, and there I was, somewhere in between, trying to figure out where I fit in. It was in this strange world that I first met Tom Buchanan. Tom was a man of tremendous physical presence. Tall, athletic, with the arrogance that seemed to ooze from every pore. He was a man who had inherited his wealth, someone whose family had passed down riches for generations. He was used to getting what he wanted, and he wasn't the sort to hide that. There was something about him, something that struck me from the very first time I met him. His confidence, his dominance over the room. His power was not just in his wealth, but in his ability to control everything around him. He took what he wanted, and if anyone stood in his way, it was of no consequence. It was clear to me then that Tom was a man who had never known what it was to feel powerless, to be without something. And then there was Daisy. Daisy Buchanan was a woman who was everything Tom was not. She was soft, charming, and almost impossibly beautiful. Her smile seemed to light up the room, and her laugh was like music. She was someone who had the world at her feet, someone who had been born into privilege and who had at one point been filled with dreams of the future. But there was something about Daisy, something that wasn't quite right. Beneath her radiant exterior, there was a sadness I couldn't quite place. Something that seemed to haunt her, just beneath the surface of her ever-present smile. I had seen the surface of their lives, Tom's power, Daisy's charm. But it wasn't until I began to spend more time with them that I realized how deeply disillusioned they both were, how broken their world truly was. Their marriage was a cage, a gilded cage. Tom and Daisy loved each other in a way, but there was a selfishness to their love that left little room for anything else. Tom was a man who could never be satisfied, a man who needed more power, more control, more indulgence. Daisy, on the other hand, seemed to want something that Tom could never give her: freedom, fulfillment, a sense of something real. But, as I came to learn, Daisy wasn't willing to give up the security that Tom's wealth and power provided. It wasn't long before I realized that Tom was having an affair. His mistress, Myrtle Wilson, was a woman from the Valley of Ashes, a Thai. desolate place that lay between West Egg and New York. The Valley of Ashes was a place of industrial waste, where the working class lived in squalor, where life seemed to have little meaning outside of surviving. Myrtle was married to George Wilson, a man whose garage was the only business in the valley, a man who was kind but perpetually beaten down by life. But Myrtle, like many others, wasn't content with her life in the valley. She wanted more. She wanted to be part of the world Tom inhabited. The world of wealth, of excitement, of possibility. Tom took me with him one afternoon to meet Myrtle. We drove to New York, and the entire trip was filled with Tom's usual air of superiority. He didn't care that Myrtle was married, didn't care that he was breaking up her home. All that mattered to Tom was that Myrtle could provide him with something that Daisy couldn't. A sense of excitement, a sense of rebellion. We arrived at the small apartment that Tom had rented for their affair, and as soon as I stepped inside, I felt a deep sense of unease. The apartment was gaudy, filled with cheap furniture and extravagant trinkets that seemed to be trying too hard to look important. Myrtle, for her part, was dressed in the finest clothes she could afford, trying to pass herself off as something more than she was, trying to be a part of the world Tom had brought her into. What struck me most, though, was the way Tom treated Myrtle. He was condescending, dismissive, treating her as though she was nothing more than an object, something to be used when he was bored, something to be discarded when he had his fill. Myrtle, in turn, fawned over Tom, desperate to be a part of his world. But Tom never truly saw her. She was just another possession, another conquest. It was in that moment that I fully understood the emptiness of the world I had found myself in. This was a world where people used each other to fill the voids in their lives. A world where love was a transaction, where power was a game. It was a world where the pursuit of happiness came at the cost of everyone around you. And it wasn't just Tom who lived this way. Daisy, too, was caught in the same web, tangled in a life she had built but didn't truly want. But in all of this, there was one person who stood apart, Jay Gatsby. Gatsby was a man whose name was known to everyone, though no one truly knew him. His mansion loomed across the bay from my house, towering over the rest of West Egg, like something out of a fairy tale. Gatsby's parties were legendary, filled with laughter, music, and guests from all walks of life. Everyone came to Gatsby's mansion, but no one seemed to know him. He was a man shrouded in mystery, a man whose wealth and power were both a secret and a spectacle. People talked about him, whispered about him, but no one knew the truth. The first time I saw Gatsby, it wasn't at one of his parties, but from a distance. He was standing alone on the lawn of his mansion, looking out over the water at the faint green light at the end of Daisy's dock. That light, it was always there, always shining in the distance. It was a symbol of something Gatsby wanted but could never have. It was the light at the end of Daisy's dock, and it was everything he had built his life around. That green light represented a dream that was always just beyond his reach. Gatsby wasn't like Tom. Tom was a man who sought power for its own sake, a man who was content with using others to get what he wanted. Gatsby, on the other hand, sought something more. He sought a future with Daisy, a future where he could recreate the past. But as much as Gatsby had everything, as much as he had wealth and luxury, he was still incomplete. His life, his world, was a fantasy, a dream that could never truly come true. And yet, in that dream, there was something beautiful. Gatsby's world was built on hope, on ambition, on the belief that anything was possible. But that hope was fragile. It was a dream that, no matter how much he reached for, it would always remain just out of his grasp. And that, I think, was the tragedy of Gatsby's world. He had built everything around something that was never meant to be. As I watched Gatsby that night, standing alone in the distance, staring at that green light across the bay, I realized that his whole world, his mansion, his parties, his success, was built on a dream of a past that could never be recaptured. But the question that lingered in my mind was this: could Gatsby ever let go of the past? Could he really build a future with Daisy? Or was he doomed to chase a dream that would never be his? Couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. How long could Gatsby's illusions last? What would happen when the truth began to unravel? As I left that night, I knew one thing for sure. The story of Gatsby was far from over. And the most difficult parts were still to come.